Young Rock took a week off, so in this episode, we're taking a trip back to the 70s. Before Rocky Johnson was portrayed by Joseph Lee Anderson on Young Rock, he was portrayed by The Rock himself in 1999. We're talking That 70s Show, Season 1, Episode 15 on Pro Wrestling Repackaged. Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining us again. My name is Chris.
And my name is Tessa.
And this is Pro Wrestling Repackaged, where the squared circle meets the small screen. So since there wasn't a new episode of Young Rock this week, we thought we'd take the opportunity to do something that we plan on doing a bit more of in the future. In fact, a lot more of in the future, which is talk about wrestlers appearing on an episode of a sitcom. This will be a bit of a precursor to a planned future season of this show, and it's very appropriate right now given that we're currently covering Young Rock. We're discussing Season 1, Episode 15 of That 70s Show, That Wrestling Show, which features The Rock as Rocky Johnson, and also features Ken Shamrock, Matt and Jeff Hardy, the big Cat Ernie Ladd, and even Judo Gene LaBelle. But before we dive in, I know we wanted to make mention of this article that recently came out from The Wrap, and it's called Young Rock Had the Largest Digital Launch of Any NBC Comedy Ever. And this article talks about the fact that Young Rock had the most multi-generational viewing of any broadcast comedy this season so far, and at this point, the premiere of Young Rock has amassed 11.8 million total viewers. So that's a 3.4 rating in the adult 18 to 49 demographic. Of course, this isn't just the TV broadcast, but includes Hulu, Peacock, and the NBC app. So at least the premiere of Young Rock, the pilot, has done very well for itself, even past its initial airing.
And I think that makes sense. There's something in Young Rock, I think, for everybody. Since it's boasting the most multi-generational audience, I think there's something for kids when we're talking about 10-year-old Dewey. There's something for, veteran wrestling fans. It really kind of crosses all of those generations.
I think one of the best things about it is that it's someone that you know.
Right.
It's Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Mm-hmm. Most people have some sort of a familiarity with him at this point.
We all know him some way.
Right. And it's a family sitcom,
right,
which typically I won't be checking out new network family sitcoms in this day and age. It's just not something that I watch really anymore. Maybe if it's streaming on Hulu or Netflix after the fact and binge the entire season. So I think that there's something to be said for the fact that it's holding up very well. I think it was only behind This Is Us the first week, which is very impressive because This Is Us is probably one of the bigger shows currently airing on TV in terms of a network show.
Everyone watches that.
Yeah, so I think that's good news for Young Rock. Probably bodes very well for a season 2, at the very least, I would say. And it's just good to see that a wrestling project like this, a wrestling-related comedy, a scripted comedy based on a wrestling family, can do this well because it opens the door for more. We've had Glow. We have Stephen Amell's upcoming show Heels. We even have Ultraviolet and Blue Demon at Disney Channel coming up. But this opens the door for more, I think.
Well, and I think wrestling isn't this embarrassing secret anymore. I think with people like The Rock or John Cena in the past few years, they're really making it mainstream in a way. They're bringing these stories to the forefront. And so maybe that'll make people more interested in professional wrestling.
Also, just in terms of the crossover from wrestling fans, I know that there was an encore viewing of the premiere of Young Rock that aired recently after an episode of Raw. So that probably helped a lot in bringing in wrestling fans who were just watching Raw, and now here's Young Rock. You don't have to tune in on a separate night. You don't have to go search it out. Here it is, and if you want more of it, here's where it airs. You can get it on Peacock. You can get it on Hulu. So I think that probably did a lot in terms of getting wrestling fans on board. I know we talked about the ratings being a bit down from the premiere to episode 2, but episode 3's rating really kind of held steady. It was a 0.7 rating, which was down just a bit from 0.8, which translates to about 3.22 million viewers, which is down a little bit from 3.61 million, which is negligible at this point. And, the amount of people watching live versus the amount of people watching on demand later on on streaming or whatever, it's probably relatively small at this point. I don't think people are really watching TV in that way anymore. It's just not a behavior that, especially younger generations have. So being on so many different platforms, being available on Hulu, Peacock, and the NBC app is only going to help Young Rock. And I'd be interested to see if at some point it gets licensed out to something like Netflix later on. And, I don't place a whole lot of stock in things like ratings and things like that. It's just in the beginning of a new show, it's interesting to watch the trends and watch kind of how it's doing on TV versus how it's doing on streaming. And I think we're seeing that Young Rock is something that's doing very well on streaming. And I wonder if the conversation would be bigger if Young Rock were exclusively a streaming show, or if it were a show that kind of came out all at once. You can binge all the episodes at once.
Right. I don't think we can have a clear representation of who's watching until it's completely done. And then we'll see where it picks up, because I think so many people might just decide, no, I don't want to wait week to week. I just want to watch it all in one shot.
Right. I mean, we have seen with things like WandaVision that people will enjoy a week-to-week show if it's on a platform that they're already kind of tuned into.
Right.
And network TV is probably something that a lot of people, especially our age, maybe don't even have. We don't have cable. We watch this live on the NBC app, and then we watch it again on demand on Hulu. So it's just something that I'm kind of interested in, and, we'll definitely make note of whenever there's something newsworthy like this. So no Rock Says segment this week, because The Rock spoke about 2 sentences total in the episode that we're about to review. But with that, let's now take a look at That 70s Show, Season 1, Episode 15, That Wrestling Show. Directed by David Traynor, written by Jeff and Jackie Filgo, story edited by Mark Hudis and Philip Stark. Now, the idea of a wrestler appearing on a sitcom in general is something that always brings me joy. Because I feel like anytime you think back, you're like, oh yeah, Vader did appear on Boy Meets World. And Mankind also appeared on Boy Meets World. And wait a minute, Billy Gunn appeared on Sabrina the Teenage Witch. What? So it always kind of either gives you a very happy memory or a very bewildered, how did this happen type of experience. So I'm a big fan of wrestlers appearing on sitcoms in general. What is your experience with seeing a wrestler show up on a sitcom?
Well, I think they go together really well. It's if you have the right wrestler, someone who's already kind of, in their performances kind of has that humorous take in their promos or whatever, they can do really well with it. Maybe you wouldn't want to see someone with a gimmick that's really rough in a comedy, because it wouldn't really make sense. But someone like The Rock, at this point, it works really well.
But sometimes those people can surprise you.
That's true, too.
Goldberg's been in a bunch of things. And, granted, I haven't seen most of them, but sometimes you can be surprised by someone who isn't really allowed to showcase a certain side of themselves, or maybe certain skills that they have, certain acting skills, what they can really portray versus, when they're a wrestler, they're kind of in this box for most of their career, unless they change gimmicks,
Right.
But someone like The Rock being able to spread his wings just a tiny bit and not necessarily portray The Rock. All right,
he's kind of The Rock.
Let's be honest. He basically portrayed The Rock being Rocky Johnson in this episode, but it's still different from his experience as a wrestler, which is the only experience he had ever had at this point. And we'll get into kind of where he was in his career. But before we really dive into the nuts and bolts of this episode, what is your experience with That 70s Show in general? Because I know that you watched it when you were younger, and I have not. This was my first experience with it.
That 70s Show is kind of a show that was just always on at my house, kind of like wrestling. It was I don't remember actively putting it on, but it was always on.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, we were always watching it. I think this might also be because my brother is 7 years older than me. So the content that I was consuming was probably more geared towards someone his age. So I was when the show started, I was 3. But I always remember watching it. And I always liked it. I think it's fun.
So this is a show that I never watched. And you asked me why earlier as we were watching this. And I think it's just because it just wasn't on my radar at 9 years old, around that age, 9 to 15, really during that time period, my world was kind of, at 9 years old, it was kind of just like Nickelodeon and wrestling exclusively. And I was watching sitcoms, but they were what was on Nick at Night or
Right.
TV Land. I was very big on Nick at Night and TV Land, just spending the night watching things like Cheers and Three's Company and things like that. But I was also watching stuff like Full House, what my sister was watching at the time. So it's interesting that we both kind of had the older sibling who kind of dictated some of the things that we got into as well. But for me, it was more Full House, Family Matters, that type of show.
Yours was more wholesome.
Yes, more wholesome. And I think that speaks a lot to my taste still now as an adult.
That might be more of like, your older sibling is a sister.
Sure.
I have brothers.
Yeah, there are plenty of things from my childhood, like Mary-Kate and Ashley VHS tapes, that I would not have been exposed to had I not been influenced by what my sister was also watching.
Mine was like Fast and Furious all the time.
But hey, also related to The Rock. So in general, though, my thoughts on that 70s show based on this episode is that it was about what I expected. I had fun watching this. Wrestling aside, I thought it was an enjoyable sitcom to watch. I thought Topher Grace in particular was pretty funny, and he gave me a very Tobey Maguire Spider-Man vibe. I hate the dad, which you told me everyone loves him.
Oh, Red's great.
I think the reason why I hate him is just subconscious because he's the guy from RoboCop who comes in and says, "Bitches leave." He is also apparently in another Ashton Kutcher project, that Netflix show, The Ranch, which neither of us have seen.
That's basically like low-key of that 70s show reunion.
Interesting.
Because
okay.
it's got Ashton Kutcher, it has Danny Masterson. Is Wilmer Valderrama in it? I'm not sure. He probably guest stars in it, but there's a bunch of them show up.
But yeah, that dude has been in a ton of other things and just has a very distinctive face. And the thing about his character that he kind of reminds me of like a 70s Archie Bunker type of character. And am I right in saying that?
He's like your typical like hard-ass father who's dealing with his son and his idiot friends who are just basically living in his basement.
The mother, Deborah Jo Rupp, she has also been in a ton of things. Most notably to me, Seinfeld, where she plays Jerry's manager. Jerry's very annoying manager in a couple of episodes. And she was also in WandaVision, too. And the only other person from this show that I recognize, aside from, obviously, Mila Kunis and Ashton Kutcher, is the dude who plays Bob, because he also plays a character named Stu Browdy in Curb Your Enthusiasm, who is very notable in our life because he is where I got the phrase "freak you" from, which I like to say sometimes. But yeah, overall, if you forced me to watch another episode of this show, I probably wouldn't put up too much of a fight. You know, it's not like you forcing me to watch The Dukes of Hazzard or something.
That's rude. My two favorite 70s-oriented shows.
I'm more of a Welcome Back Kotter type of guy, but why don't you give us an overview of this episode in general and what the overall story was?
Okay, yeah. So, like I said, Red Foreman kind of is that typical hard-ass dad. And his son Eric, who's the main character, he's the, usual lazy son. So that's kind of their relationship. And Kitty, Eric's mom, does not like that. She wants to see them do some father-son bonding. She really wants them to have a good relationship. So at the same time, the gang, that's what they're all called, Eric's friends, they learned of a wrestling show that is coming to Kenosha that Rocky Johnson will be featured on. So Red agrees to go with them to this show because Kitty's going to keep nagging him if he doesn't. And so they all go to this show, but also happening in this episode, Midge, who is Donna's mom, starts seeing a questionable therapist, and Jackie becomes Kelso's love slave of sorts.
Ugh. So immediately, the father-son bonding over wrestling and going to a wrestling show is something that I kind of relate to. Growing up, I was always very much into different things than I think my dad expected me to be. I mean, I had Mets wallpaper from the time I was a little kid, and I did not care about baseball at all. I went from like Batman and Power Rangers to wrestling, and my dad just had no idea how to relate to me. But he did used to sometimes watch wrestling. He would flip it on if Raw or SmackDown or Nitro or something like that was on. He'd talk about it sometimes. He even played video games with me a few times when we first got the N64, and that was still a novelty. But he did take me to a lot of wrestling shows. So this was something that I did kind of relate to, except for the fact that my dad did not get into it the way that Red did after like 20 seconds putting up a fight. My dad would just kind of sit there. Mm-hmm. The biggest example of that I remember is my dad taking two friends and I to see the WWE ECW revival. I think it was one of the first tapings at the Hammerstein Ballroom. And just sitting down the whole time, even when every single person around him was like standing up, going crazy. I just remember like Kurt Angle's coming up. We'd like jump out of our seats. We're going crazy. And it's just my dad sitting down with like his arms crossed in the middle of this crowd. So I do feel bad about that. But Red was having a good time here. And that's kind of a parallel that I think we can make to Young Rock in that, the reluctant person being dragged to a wrestling show in Karen in Young Rock, winding up having a really great time, courtesy of Rocky Johnson, really. In both instances, it is him who wins over the reluctant wrestling show goer. But do you have any experiences or memories of going to a wrestling show with your dad or with a big group of people like this?
I never went with a big group of people. I would go with my dad, my mom, and sometimes my brothers.
Deb went?
Yeah, my mom would
What shows was she going to?
Well, they were just house shows in Youngstown. Okay. So never anything big, but my dad's not a wrestling fan.
Right. It's funny because I feel like he knows more members of the Dragon Gate roster than he does of WWE.
He really loves Dragon Gate. So here's the thing. He doesn't really like wrestling, but he'll get into it if it's something that's kind of funny. So like his favorite wrestler is the Hurricane. And he's really familiar with, NWA and WCW from, 80s and 90s. Right. He was watching it with my brother and everything and, his friends in the 80s. But yeah, he kind of, when he watches it, it's more of kind of a mocking almost, which if you know my dad,
yes,
that's on brand for him.
Well, there's also an element in this episode of being dragged to a wrestling show by your significant other.
Right. And I mean, there's two cases in this episode of people not really being into wrestling and wanting to go. So you have Red, who was a wrestler in high school, who just kind of says, no, that's fake. I'm not interested in that at all.
What I did was real. That stuff on TV, that's all an act.
This is all just a bunch of tricks, I think is what he called it.
I mean, he didn't say the F word explicitly, but
it was implied.
Yeah, I think that's still grounds for getting punched in the face by young Dwayne Johnson.
But then you also have Jackie, who is Kelso's girlfriend, who's like a stereotypical rich, girly girl who is not a fan of wrestling. And she's only going because, as we said, she's kind of Kelso's slave at this point. They slept together and now she just kind of does whatever he says. And that's contrasted with Donna, who is the tomboy of the group. She's been friends with these guys for forever, and she loves wrestling. She gets into it. She wrestles with Eric in the basement. They're all kind of wrestling in the car on the way to the show.
I also like how Red and Eric were trading master locks at the very end of the show. After they come home from the wrestling show, they're all hyped up on it. So they're wrestling around and just giving each other the master lock.
Have you ever given anyone the master lock?
Oh, yeah. The thing with the master lock is it was one of the easier submissions to just walk up to someone and do, like in school. So, yeah, we were doing master lock challenges all the time in the cafeteria. That was a big thing, yeah.
My personal wrestling experiences were on a trampoline with no net and a large ladder.
A ladder on the trampoline?
Right off to the side. You're going up to the ladder and jumping.
Okay.
Yeah. Lots of frog splashes and elbow drops.
Backyard wrestling for my friends and I was a big thing, not with trash cans and light tubes and all that crap, but just doing the moves and running into the fence and pretending that it's, the ropes and jumping off of the pool deck, which in retrospect, we're very lucky that no one broke anything.
I fell off of the trampoline. Really kind of hurt my head. Because like I said, we didn't have any net. Most trampolines, the big trampolines have the
Well,
large net.
Like they said, don't try this at home. You didn't listen to Ron Simmons when he said, "Don't be a bonehead."
No.
Rey Mysterio had surgery 5 times in his right knee, and you are over here jumping off of trampolines and landing on your head.
Yeah.
So the portrayal of wrestling in the 70s is kind of a mixed bag here. There are some things that are accurate, like, wrestling shows being held in armories and smaller venues like that. Wrestling still very much a regional, territorial thing at this point. Another thing that is accurate is the fact that, yes, there were little people in wrestling, and that was still a popular thing at this point. Rocky Johnson is wrestling several little people in his match that doesn't even officially start because they don't ring the bell, by the way. But there are a few inaccuracies, which, yes, it's a sitcom. I'm not expecting documentary level. If I don't expect that of Young Rock, I definitely don't expect that of that 70s show. But the fact that this was a WWF show that they were apparently going to.
In 1976, 77.
Yeah, 77. The WWF, number one, didn't even exist at that time. It was still the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. You see that old blocky yellow WWF logo hanging up on the wall. First of all, I missed that logo, but that was very anachronistic for the 70s time period.
Right, but since this show's coming out in 1999, it's featuring 4 WWF wrestlers.
4 roster members, yes. 4 current roster members. So obviously there is a synergy going on here. So we have to pretend, as we do in so many other things, that WWF/WWE is wrestling. It's the only thing that has ever existed in wrestling. It has always been there and it will always be there. And Vince McMahon created it. But a few more of the inaccuracies of this episode were the fact that Rocky Johnson was not wrestling for the Worldwide Wrestling Federation in the 70s. He was still very much in the NWA system. And I don't think Rocky Johnson at this point in his career would have been wrestling little people either. I may be wrong. But at this point, Rocky Johnson, what he was really doing in the mid-70s was he's wrestling Harley Race for the NWA Championship. He's teaming with Pedro Morales and challenging for the NWA Tag Team Championships. He didn't work for the WWF until 1982. He was mostly working in Tennessee and Florida at this point. So him even wrestling in Kenosha would probably not be happening at this point in time.
It honestly, it doesn't even look like it would be a major wrestling show. It just looks like it would be some tiny regional promotion because, nobody's given names. Except for Rocky Johnson. He's the only one that has a name on this card. And they're super psyched to see him, but...
Well, WWF house shows, even really getting into the 2000s, did have a very stripped back type of feel. And were, especially in B towns and C towns, smaller affairs. I was going to WWF house shows at the Nassau Coliseum, but they weren't always to that scale. So I can't speak exactly to the experience of a local wrestling show in the 70s, but I have been to quite a few wrestling shows in high school gyms, VFW halls, and this is pretty much what that experience feels like.
Right.
So we talked about Rocky Johnson and what he was really doing in the mid-70s, but let's talk now about The Rock and his portrayal of his father. First of all, this was The Rock's first acting gig or television appearance outside of wrestling. So it's interesting that it's portraying his father. And all these years later, he has a show about
his father.
His show. He has a show where his father is a very central figure. So I thought that was interesting and kind of appropriate for us to be covering this, and I think that's why we chose to do this instead of doing one of The Rock's movies or something, because it is kind of topical at this point. It's a throwback show, and Rocky Johnson is kind of a central figure of this episode. But yeah, this was The Rock's first appearance outside of being on WWF TV. His next acting gig after this would have been an appearance on the TV series The Net, which I think is an adaptation of the movie with Sandra Bullock, which is awful, followed by an appearance on Star Trek Voyager in 2000. And then that would, of course, lead to his first really big role in The Mummy Returns and The Scorpion King in the early 2000s. But starting here, kind of from square one with The Rock's acting career, what did you think of his portrayal of Rocky Johnson?
Well, like we said, he's basically just playing Rocky Johnson as if Rocky Johnson was just The Rock, but with a tiny afro.
And a bad singlet.
Because, I mean, they didn't even cover The Rock's tattoo.
No.
I mean, I don't think we get enough of a taste of The Rock's acting in this. This is just really him just dipping his toes in the acting world. And he only says like 3 things tops.
Yeah, we have a very limited sample size to go off of here. But I think what he is given, I think he delivers pretty well.
Right, yeah.
Which is not shocking because he was one of the best performers in general in wrestling at that time. In 1999, his career is just skyrocketing. He is red hot. It would really only be a matter of time before he became number 1 and Steve Austin kind of ascended down the ranks.
Yeah.
This is still at kind of the point where Rock and Austin are neck and neck and really 1A and 1B if you think about it. But Austin had more of a crossover presence, I think, at this point.
Yeah.
But The Rock would quickly gain on him and then surpass him, I think, just exponentially.
We're talking about 2 completely different personalities. So where one is going to excel in a certain type of thing, because at the same time, Stone Cold is in, what is it called, Nash Bridges.
Yeah.
He's guest starring on that show.
And that's more of a serious role.
Right.
And there's action scenes and he's got dialogue and things of that nature. Now, granted, I haven't seen that since the time it aired because I do remember checking that out just to see Austin. Because
I saw him in a suit dancing.
Yeah.
I flipped through, we were flipping through channels and there it was on and there he was. I was like, wait a second.
That picture that you tweeted out.
I don't want to see Stone Cold in a suit dancing.
It's very
slow
awkward.
Dancing.
Yeah.
Like some
I like
gala.
to think that he's still wearing the shorts. But The Rock as Rocky Johnson. First of all, Rocky Johnson disposes of multiple little people in under a minute flat. Maybe even 30 seconds. And in that amount of time, Red is just quite taken with him to the point where he's busting into the locker room to get an autograph.
He's loving it. Yeah.
Which is where we see The Rock really flex his acting chops, if you will, if you want to call it that.
You pile drive a little guy and the whole crowd turns on you.
I really like the line where he goes, I have a son and one day he's going to have this exact tattoo that I don't actually have in real life, but we didn't bother to cover up.
They're really driving home that point that Rocky Johnson's going to have this son.
Yeah, and he's going to be the most electrifying man in sports entertainment.
I loved Red's line right after that. He's just like, yeah, good luck with that.
Good luck with that, whatever that is, because sports entertainment
isn't a thing.
And it's really still not a thing. It's a thing in Vince McMahon's mind, but it's pro wrestling.
Call it what it is.
Call it what it is. I think it's interesting to kind of compare The Rock as Rocky Johnson versus Joseph Lee Anderson, and definitely not fair because Joseph Lee Anderson is amazing as Rocky Johnson. He has the look down, the hair, the gear. He's very charismatic, as was Rocky Johnson, and obviously as is The Rock. I think that, there's a solid comparison to be made there, but Joseph Lee Anderson is Rocky Johnson. He's playing Rocky Johnson. Yeah. The Rock here playing Rocky Johnson is really only Rocky Johnson in name.
Yeah. He's just there because he's the most famous person in the world right now, and his dad just so happened to be a wrestler in the 70s.
I do appreciate the fact that, though, in 1999, The Rock was still kind of uplifting his dad,
right,
and just kind of like giving him a signal boost, in a point where not many current wrestling fans would have known who Rocky Johnson was. Kids who got into wrestling in the Attitude Era, they're not necessarily going to be familiar with Rocky Johnson. They might not even know. They might not even know that The Rock had a dad who was a wrestler unless it was mentioned in an interview or something like that. So this is the first instance of The Rock on a kind of a major platform saying, hey, my dad was my hero. He was, a very influential wrestler. And he was very popular. We see the gang, they love Rocky Johnson.
They love him, yeah.
He's their favorite.
Yeah, they're really into what he's doing. Maybe they're also really into the little people wrestling because it's a kind of a novelty act. But they seem to watch Wrestling Weekly. When the show opens, they're watching wrestling on TV. And they're really into it.
I think the portrayal of wrestling in general is kind of as this, it's kind of this wacky thing that if you're into, you're really into. But if you're an outsider, you're kind of like, what is this?
It's probably still a little carny at this stage.
Oh, sure.
Like, we're talking it's 1977 in this episode.
Yeah, it's still very much.
It's not mainstream.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like the stories that I hear about wrestling at this time period was always someone's grandmother watching it in the 70s and 80s.
You know what? Like, my grandfather used to watch wrestling, like Pittsburgh stuff. So he was really into Bruno Sammartino and this dude named Mr. Clean, who I've been trying to figure out who he is for like 2 decades. I don't know who that is.
Mr. Clean.
Yeah, someone named Mr. Clean in Pittsburgh.
Wow.
So we're talking like the 50s and 60s wrestling.
Mr. Clean.
Mr. Clean.
You know, some people say that I bear a striking resemblance to Mr. Clean.
It's not the same guy. It's not that. But I do wonder if the names are, if it's related. I don't know who this man is.
So in addition to The Rock, we had a number of other wrestlers appear in this episode, most notably Ken Shamrock, credited as wrestler number 1, and Matt and Jeff Hardy, credited as wrestler number 2 and 3. So not only The Rock coming over from the WWF, but they sent over Ken Shamrock and Matt and Jeff Hardy to basically just be bodies. I mean, Ken Shamrock did have a line.
You know what? I think Ken Shamrock stole this episode. I liked his part more than the stuff with The Rock. They're heckling him on the outside. Eric and Red are heckling him. And he's just, I give and I give and I give. And this is what they give.
And then he scares the crap out of them.
Yeah.
As Ken Shamrock just naturally does.
He's got a nice hair in this.
Oh, yeah. An awful, horrible, amazing wig that he was wearing in this, along with a singlet. Everyone was wearing singlets. But this was not Ken Shamrock's first acting role, if you want to call it an acting role. I think it'd be generous, but he was also in a 1997 movie called Champions. He played a character called The King. And he was also on a 1998 episode of Nash Bridges as Pike. So Nash Bridges, I feel like we could just do a Nash Bridges season at this point.
There seems to be a lot of crossover.
There seems to be, yeah, definitely a lot of crossover. Too bad Kevin Nash wasn't on Nash Bridges.
Oh, no.
Or was he? We shall find out at some point. But Ken Shamrock has, he's had some other roles in the years since, but definitely not a crossover wrestler actor. But we also had Matt and Jeff Hardy, wrestler number 2 and wrestler number 3. 1999, an important year for the Hardys. That's kind of their breakout year. 1999-2000, they're really starting to become very, very popular, especially with younger fans. I remember the Hardys at this time in school. Everyone loved the Hardys. It was kind of the changeover from everyone being really into DX to the Hardys being kind of the cool thing going.
The Hardys were my favorite tag team from that time period.
Yeah.
I preferred them over Edge and Christian and definitely preferred them over the Dudleys.
Yeah, the Hardys and Lita were a great kind of package act, I think, at that time. This was definitely their first, I guess, acting roles, if you want to call it that. Maybe their only. I didn't really see anything else on their IMDb pages.
I don't think Matt and Jeff Hardy have the same, acting appeal as maybe The Rock.
Well, maybe a Matt Hardy in more recent years.
Yeah.
I think he's done quite a bit more than I think anyone ever thought that he would do in terms of character.
Yeah.
So I did like Jeff's boots with the horseshoes on them. Very, very Hangman Page look. It's just weird seeing Jeff in trunks, though. I don't think I've ever seen Jeff Hardy in trunks.
Well, even Matt, whatever he
was wearing a
the
singlet. Yeah.
I don't want to see their legs.
And Matt Hardy's hair also
Yeah.
was really, really, really doing something in this episode.
Really big mullet-looking thing.
Yeah. We should mention that Matt pinned Jeff after a backdrop that I didn't think looked great at all. Earlier, we saw Rocky Johnson just absolutely massacre these little people to the delight of Red. I don't think he got anywhere near as into this match. But we did mention Gene LaBelle, Judo Gene LaBelle, the godfather of grappling, played the referee. Now, for those who don't know, just very quickly, Judo Gene LaBelle is a legendary figure. He popularized grappling in fighting circles and basically laid the foundation for what we know today as MMA. He had a hand in training people like Chuck Norris, Roddy Piper, Mondo Guerrero, Ronda Rousey, most recently. But the thing that really gets me about Gene LaBelle that I didn't know until today is that this dude has apparently appeared and done stunts in a ton of things, dating back to the early 60s. And scrolling down his IMDb page, I was just laughing out loud at some of the things he's been on. Just briefly, some of the things he's been on that are notable to the two of us. Bonanza.
My favorite.
The Green Hornet. Batman 66, Laverne and Shirley. He did stunts on Laverne and Shirley. He was in Rocky and Rocky 4 doing stunts. He did stunts in Fantasy Island. He was in Kojak, Knight Rider, RoboCop, The Lost Boys, No Holds Barred, wrestling movie, Perfect Strangers. He was in the same show as Balky. He was on Baywatch. He was on Family Matters. 3 Ninjas Knuckle Up.
Wait.
Yeah. 3 Ninjas. The thing that I've been trying to get you to watch that you absolutely refuse to watch.
I'm not going to watch that.
If you watch 3 Ninjas with me, I'll watch some more Dukes of Hazzard with you. How about that?
I don't know if it's worth it.
He was on Married with Children. He was on Walker, Texas Ranger, The Sandlot, Jingle All the Way, a Mike Tyson TV movie, Vegas Vacation, Liar, Liar, Batman and Robin, My Giant. Like, this dude's career. Sabrina the Teenage Witch, another Ashton Kutcher project, Dude, Where's My Car? Bruce Almighty, Reno 911, Along Came Polly, Spider-Man 2, Entourage. Like, this man has been in everything, and that's about a third of his IMDb page because he's in a ton of other things. To name them all would just take far too long, and it would be most of this episode, really. But this dude has been in so many things, and I had absolutely no idea, and a lot of these things I have watched.
Now, is that a combination of just him doing stunt work versus him like actually appearing?
So most of it is stunt work,
right?
But he has appeared in things as like he'll have a random role as like a bartender, or like in this episode he was a referee. But he has a lot of kind of random kind of bit player roles like that. It was just kind of funny scrolling through his IMDb page and seeing all of these things that he has been in, and they're all very, very, very different. And some of the things I'm like, Laverne and Shirley, what kind of stunt sequence is he doing in Laverne and Shirley?
I guess you'd be surprised.
Yeah. Also, a notable guest appearance in this episode was the big cat Ernie Ladd, who was credited as playing Rocky Johnson's manager. Ernie Ladd was one of the first black wrestlers to work heel, and he was one of the most hated heels of the 70s. Like, this dude got the type of heat that you can't get today for various reasons. And this was I think his first and only acting role. But he initially denies Red and Eric the autograph and then eventually relents and lets them get one autograph. And then that's it for Rocky Johnson. He's not signing any more autographs.
Well, Red kind of scares him because Red's a war veteran. And he says, I'm probably the only one in this room who's killed a man. So kind of puts the fear in him. Yeah,
Ernie Ladd didn't feel like dealing with that. It's all a work. There's no reason for anyone to die here. But a very interesting episode of a show that I have never seen, but contained a lot of wrestling history within this one episode. Some of it accurate, most of it not. But I enjoyed watching this episode. Now, I don't know if we'll ever watch that 70s show in full. I don't even know if it's available on anything. We found this episode on Dailymotion, so if you do want to watch the episode, you can find it on Dailymotion. But I had fun with this. You know, I enjoyed this. This was kind of a nice change from Young Rock, but also not that different in a way.
And the time periods aren't too far off from what we're seeing in Young Rock. The last episode of Young Rock was in 1982. That's just a few years before this time period with that 70s show. So they kind of go hand in hand.
So yeah, I thought this was fun to do. I'm glad we did this instead of watching like the Tooth Fairy or something like we thought we were going to do initially. I'm glad we had this idea. And I don't know about you, but I can't wait until we do eventually get to do a whole season of these type of episodes where we look at wrestler guest appearances in sitcoms, because there's quite a few and they all sound absolutely amazing.
I mean, I love sitcoms, so I'm bound to enjoy that.
Yeah. This is kind of our wheelhouse here, so that's why we started the podcast. That's going to do it for this bonus episode of Pro Wrestling Repackaged. Thank you so much for listening. Join us next time as we continue reviewing Season 1 of Young Rock.
Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at PWRepackaged and email us at pwrepackaged@gmail.com.
Subscribe on Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. And visit pwrepackaged.crd.co for links to everything.
If you'd like to support the show, please consider leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, or any other platform that features reviews.
Pro Wrestling Repackaged is a Multitrack Minds production. Visit multitrackminds.com for projects and audio production services by yours truly.